Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to worship again. Let's see if somebody stole my sermon. Nope, that's good. It's always bad to get to church and somebody's stolen the sermon. By the way, that only serves to make the sermon longer. All right, becoming great really does begin with our expectations. Repeat after me. How we do anything is how we do everything. One more time. How we do anything is how we do everything. For 3 weeks, we've been talking about what it takes to become a great or greater church. Last Sunday, I'm going to tell you yet another person signed the commitment to be and become a greater church. Okay, some of you all need to be paying better attention. Thank you, girls. Next time, if you really think it's worth clapping for, though, here's what I want you to do. You ready? All right. Now, if you want to know the secrets, you might want to sit closer. So you know. Listen, we've been talking about what it takes to be a great church, and we've talked about how we're going to grow, but it takes commitment. And we've talked about the 5 things. Y'all remember? Put your hands up. Let's remember the 5 things because it's important. To become a great church, we have to remember that great churches worship. Great churches do. Great churches do. Great churches do fellowship. And great churches. All right, turn to a neighbor, give them a high five, and say, you better remember that. All right. Now, I want you to know that I have been a very busy pastor the last week. I have been to 4, count them, 4, right? 4 flock meetings. And I want you to know that my expectations for the First Christian Church in Duncanville have grown and grown and grown with each flock meeting. If you've been to a flock meeting, would you please stand? Wow, look at all these people. Now, the following questions are, no, stay standing. The following questions are only for you. Okay? So here they are. If you weren't at a flock meeting, you don't get an answer. First of all, if you had a good time, say yes.
Yes.
You had a pretty good time. If you learned something new about someone, including the new pastor, but maybe somebody else, say yes.
Yes.
If you think others, mainly the people sitting down in the pews around you, should think about or commit to coming to their flock meeting when it comes, say yes.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Give them a round of applause. Have them sit down. I want you to know that the flock meetings have been a great time. We've been hearing stories. We've been laughing hard. We've been sharing tears. It's amazing. Not one of the 4 flock meetings have not had laughter and tears because of what the church is doing and meaning in people's lives. That's powerful. You thought I was doing it only so I could get to know you. How many of you at your flock meeting, when you learned about somebody's pain or when you learned about somebody's joy, didn't go, that's my church? Do it all the time. That's what happens when the people of God get together and share the story. And that's what we're talking about today, is sharing the story. Together we're going to build a great and glorious church for God. For 3 weeks we've been talking about this theme. We've got 2 more weeks. And it only gets better after this series gets done. We only move up. We only go forward. We only go out into our world. You see, we talked 2 weeks ago about the first thing that great churches have, and we talked about how great churches have awe-inspiring worship. Repeat that with me. Great churches have awe-inspiring worship. All right. Now, worship is, quite frankly, the basic act of God's people. When you read the text from Isaiah that we read for that day, we experience God's presence in a magnificent and beautiful and glorious way, and that is how God has called us to worship the Lord our God with all our being. That's actually what Jesus says is the first commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your being. And that is expressed in awe-inspired worship. Then last week we talked about the results of awe-inspiring worship. And the results of awe-inspiring worship is, of course, mountain-moving ministry. You see, we cannot have awe-inspired worship and not be moved to touch people's lives. You can't. Remember the text in Isaiah? Isaiah gets to the end of worship. God calls out, "Who will go for me?" And Isaiah responded, "Here am I. Send me." Worship leads to that. But what does that mean? Where does that take us? And one of the things that you're going to learn is that I preach in series on purpose. You're not surprised by that, are you? You're not surprised that I did this sermon series on purpose. Because I do everything around these things on purpose. Because that's how we learn. That's how we grow. That's how we are going to become a great and greater church at First Christian Church in Duncanville. And you know what? I've decided that I've got to like that phrase. I really like that. We're going to become a great and greater church at First Christian Church. Repeat that with me. Great and greater church.
Great and greater church.
Don't you like that? I like that. Turn to a neighbor and say, "I like that." So, last week we talked about what it meant to do mountain moving ministry, and we talked about how that meant our worship leads us to become servants. Servants. We talked about how servants think more about others than about themselves. We talked about how servants think like stewards instead of owners. We talked about how servants think about ministry not as obligation, but as opportunity to change the world we live in. And that brings us to today's sermon. That brings us to this week's theme. We started with awe-inspired worship. We moved to mountain-moving ministry. And now we're going to move where there's a more specific interpretation of that ministry. For the next 3 weeks, we're going to talk about what mountain-moving ministry really looks like and requires. And the first thing that we find out is that great churches do intentional evangelism. Say that with me. Great churches do intentional evangelism. Now, I threw that new word in there, that intentional word, because let me tell you, most churches, their method of doing evangelism is like this. They open the doors of the church building, and they have a meeting. And it kind of goes like this. We need to get out and reach our community. Let's open the doors wider. Let's open the doors wider. And if we need to, let's all go out on the porch and yell at the people to come on. It's true. Most churches, that's their real method of evangelism. I went to a church as the pastor, And I said, how do you do evangelism here? And they said, well, you know, First Christian Church has been here since 1884. I said, cool. How do they do evangelism? I said, well, we open the door. They really told me that. They said, we open the door, and if people want us, they come and find us. Guess how many new members that church had had in the previous 5 years? How many? 500? No? Somebody better help the kids. They think that I'm thinking big. 4. 4 new members in 5 years, and I was one of them. They opened the door. Because in 1952, oftentimes that was enough. They were living in the past. But they weren't living biblically. I love this text from Matthew because this text from Matthew helps us understand what the Great Commandment is really all about. Jesus said that the Great Commandment is to love God and love neighbor. How do we do that? Well, the first thing we do, and it's the first requirement of great churches, and that is to do intentional evangelism. Look at me. Look at our text with me again from Matthew. Hear these words. Matthew 28, 19 and 20. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teach them to obey everything that I have taught. And remember this, I am with you always, even to the very end of the age. Evangelism, my friends, is our response to the great commandment to love God and to love neighbor. More specifically, evangelism is, as I told the children this morning, the telling or presenting of the good news in a manner that causes people to have to choose to follow Jesus or not. And by the way, you are either a follower of Jesus or you are not a follower of Jesus. Okay, get with me. They'd have got it better if I'd have done it differently. So kids, are you ready? Okay. You are either not a follower of Jesus Christ or you are a follower of Jesus Christ. Okay. Now, that being said, you're all here. I'm assuming that if I said, and you know, I'm real shy. How many of you in this room are a follower of Jesus Christ? Okay. Now, girls, now. Okay. So, if you all are followers of Jesus Christ, then you have no reason not to do evangelism because it's been commanded by the general. Church people really get antsy when the preacher starts talking about evangelism. They get antsy and they get a little concerned because we live in a box. How many of you live in a box? All of you live in a box. It's called your personal box. This is where I live. It's where I have my faith. It's where I'm comfortable, and it's where I like who I am. And nobody can get in, and I don't have to go out. The only problem is, Jesus said, wrong. Jesus says that we are to go out into the world. Now, I love that phrase because the key word for evangelism is go. You know, most churches do evangelism by opening the doors. Churches that grow, great churches, go out and do things and bring people in. You know, if you throw a birthday party for your best friend, do you just say, y'all come? Or do you send invitations? Or do you go out and get them and bring them in? You see, sometimes you even go out and get them. Well, evangelism is bringing people to the good news. Now, I'm going to tell you a couple of things that evangelism is not. I looked for a different Bible because I actually have a better Bible for this particular demonstration. But evangelism is not taking your Bibles and beating people over the head with certain verses that tell them how bad they are. Anybody attracted to that? No. None of your friends will be either. In fact, if you practice this, you know what they're going to do every time they see you coming? They're going to run like crazy. And I'll be right behind them. Evangelism is not telling people they're going to hell. Just in case you had that question. Evangelism centers on the word go, but not just go. You have to go somewhere. Jesus says go into all the world. That's a scary thing, because as soon as I said that, you all thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to go to Africa, or Asia, China, Dallas. You know, I love this phrase because it lets me talk about you, and it lets me talk about me. If I tell you to go out into the world, for years I thought that meant that I had to go out somewhere that I really didn't want to go, where they didn't speak the language I spoke, and live in the dirt. Now, I like getting dirty. That's not really a terrible thing, but it wasn't until I figured out what Jesus was really saying here that I started to feel better. And some of you might be called to go to Africa, by the way. But when Jesus says, go into all the world, Jesus is talking to his disciples. And he's telling them to go into their world. And Jesus is telling us to go into our world. Now, where is our world? Our world, by definition, is wherever you are. Because where you are, I've learned, there you are. Thank you for laughing at that. But it's really true. Wherever you go, there you are. And Jesus says, wherever you go, take me. Which means that if you have Jesus in your heart, you're going, guess what? Jesus goes with you. Evangelism begins by our going into our world and making or strengthening or building the connections that we have all the way around us. That's been one of the beautiful things about the flock meetings. All of the connections of people that we know in the church. Building, supporting, lifting up, encouraging, strengthening, building up, encouraging, strengthening, building up. I mean, story after story after story after story after story after story of how God has moved in the people in those rooms to bring people into the church to glorify God. When we go into our world, we go to where we are the center of family, friends, our workplaces, our retirement centers, our small groups at church. Do you know there are people in this building who have been members of this church for years that need to hear the good news because they've had a bad day? They've had a bad week. They've had a hard time. The good news isn't just for those who aren't saved. The good news is for all of us who need good news in our life. How many of you would like to have good news? How many of you turn the news on television and go, oh, I'm turning this off because I can't take it another minute? Evangelism is presenting the gospel to people, telling the good news in such a way that it compels people eventually to make a choice. It's about sharing what Jesus did for the world. It's about sharing what Jesus did for you or for me. It's about sharing what Jesus will do for them or for us. Evangelism is about going out into our world, making connections and presenting a witness to them about our faith, our hope, our joy, our love, and inviting them to go on the journey with us. That's all. Inviting people to go on the journey with us. I have a friend, I was hoping she would be here today. She's in the military and she got called to some duty, and so she wasn't able to get here today. I met her 6 years ago, 5 years ago. And she was an insurance agent then. She wasn't very good. Otherwise, she probably wouldn't have joined the Army. But we talked and we became friends. And then she joined the Army and she moved. She was stationed here in Texas. And so I had a text from her yesterday. Says, you know, all those years you've invited me to church. By the way, for 5 years and during I invited her to church. Never came. Never came. Then she joined the Army and moved to Texas. Never came. But she never stopped talking to me. We're friends on Facebook. Imagine that. I get a text. She wants to know what kind of church it is. Now, listen. Her story is important because it's a part of my story. And it might become a part of your story. And it might really become a part of your story if you start to think about the people over the years that you've invited to come to worship and gave up on because they never came. Maybe the need wasn't there to really seek out the healing. It's available. Maybe the despair wasn't dark enough to come to the hope. Maybe the pain and anguish of messed up relationships wasn't bad enough to come to where relationships are based in love and grace and acceptance and forgiveness. My friends, when I talk about evangelism, I'm talking about going out into our world and inviting people to come on the journey with us. The journey to hope, the journey to life, the journey to love. That's what evangelism is. And we do it by building relationships that matter. Relationships that bring hope. Relationships that help people meet their needs. Relationships that change people's lives for the good. How often do we see and hear relationships get beat up in the press marriages beat up on television, and it's okay. You just say that's just entertainment. Friends, is the church. As followers of Jesus Christ, we are called to invite people into the presence of the holy. And I'm going to help you do that. Because it reminds me of something that's really important. Here's really important. Every Christian, and I remember every hand in this room was up at one point. Every Christian is a witness to the faith. Every Christian is a witness to the faith. The question is, what kind of witness are you to the faith? So 3 things you can do to become a better witness to the faith. First, pray. But don't just pray. You're going to pray this week for 5 people that you know either don't know Jesus, don't have a church, or aren't committed. 5 people. Now some of you say, I don't know 5 people. I guarantee you that you know 5 people that don't know Jesus, are unchurched, or uncommitted. The reason I know that is because about 70% of this town, the town you live in, is unchurched, uncommitted, or unsaved. 7 out of the 10 people around you. So now you have to go home and look at the people you know in your circles and go, I wonder which 70% it is. Start praying. You're going to pray for those 5 names. By Wednesday, 1 name is going to become really obvious to you. It's going to jump up off the page of your prayer journal. And you're going to go, that's the one. And you're going to call them. And you're going to invite them to come to worship next Sunday. Because we are going to have the most fantastic, fabulous worship service centered on World Communion Sunday and the Lord's table that you've ever had. It's going to be fabulous and wonderful. And it's going to be a great time to bring a guest to worship with you. Because they're going to experience Jesus in a great way. And don't do it like this. You wouldn't want to come to church with me next Sunday. The preacher's got this thing going. No. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to come up to them and look them in the eye. And you're going to say, I've been praying for you this week. Do you know I've never met anybody who's been offended by that line? Never, ever, ever. I've been praying for you this week. And God's told me to come and invite you to come and worship with me on Sunday. You see the empty places in this room? Well, first of all, we're having a combined worship service, so some of these places will be gone. I expect every seat in the house filled, except maybe the top row of the choir. That may be where we put the kids. Not really. Listen. So pray and invite. And then you'll have 4 names left over. You know what you're going to do with the 4 names left over? You're going to invite them to come on November 1st to hear Full Fall. Simple. You do these things all the time for every other part of your life. We do evangelism for everything, it seems, except for Jesus. So next week, We're going to pray for 5 minutes. One's going to come out. You're going to invite. They're going to come. Now, I know some of you already figured out, not everybody who you invite is going to show up. But the ones that God's touching are going to come. And I bet we have a full house. Every believer is a witness. Every believer is a witness for or against the faith. The good news is we get to decide who we're going to be. 3 weeks ago, when I invited you to build a greater church, you all were really excited, but some of you have started to figure it out. It's going to take a lot of work. It always does. We talked about worship, we talked about ministry, about becoming a servant, and now we've talked about evangelism and what it takes to do that. And I gave you some really simple steps. The people we know and love, this is really important. The people we know and love, who live around us, who work around us, who we work around, need us. Because they need the good news. And you have it. And Jesus said, go.